Your code suggests that employees of a business should enforce restrictions based on evidence such as, and I quote, the individual's physique or physical appearance, behaviour or concerns raised by other service users. Can you please define specific elements of physique, physical appearance and behaviour that you would suggest it would be appropriate for staff to base their concerns on? And can you tell us where in the Supreme Court judgment it requires this?
I think that what's required here is to take a common sense approach, right? So we are talking about, what the law requires and what our code says is not that people should be judged on how well they perform masculinity or femininity, that the actual requirement is whether or not somebody is male or female. And in most instances, we expect that when rules are set, people will follow those rules. There may be some occasions, and as we make clear in the code, the response of service providers has to be proportionate. So, for example, it wouldn't be proportionate to have somebody checking who goes into toilets. But if you are, for example, running a women's refuge, then it is legitimate to be able to make decisions about who can and cannot come into that refuge if it's a single-sex service. And
that already happens on a case-by-case basis, though, and has done for many decades. Specifically,
I think the thing about a case-by-case basis.
Let me finish, please.
Okay.
Specifically on the elements of physique, physical appearance. What is it specifically? Is it height, build, hairy legs, face shape?
I think the problem that we get into in this area is people put themselves into a position where they either say you can always tell or you can never tell. And I think actually we're in a situation where we know there is no legal documentation that you can ask for to prove somebody's sex. However, a common sense approach would understand that, for example, very many women will have had an experience of being in a pub or club toilet where a man has walked in drunk and they've said, mate, I think you're in the wrong room. That has been based on physical appearance. And we make those sorts of decisions all the time. We make those sorts of judgments all the time. But what we are clear about is this is not about how somebody dresses, whether somebody has short hair, how well somebody performs femininity or not. This is exactly about somebody's sex and whether or not they can access services. And as I say, most people we would expect to follow the rules.
What strikes me is that these are the same stereotypes that women have been trying to escape. And you haven't stated where in the Supreme Court judgment this is required. And that's because it's purely a product of the EHRC, isn't it? It's not actually in the judgment. Do you agree with the Minister who told the House last week that most people have the common sense to step in where necessary if they perceive someone to be entering the supposed wrong facilities?
So there's two things here. First of all, the question of adherence to stereotypes. It's not about stereotypes. It's about what somebody's sex is. This is about whether somebody is male or female. We have had previous versions of advice and policies set by all manner of organisations that have said people should be allowed to access services based on how they identify or present. That is exactly about their adherence to particular stereotypes. What we're saying.
Less than a minute to answer the question about the Minister, please.
The question about the Minister in terms of common sense stepping in. Our code does not cover what members of the public acting in a private capacity do. That's not our job. Our job is to provide guidance for service providers. We have been clear that service providers' response to this has to be proportionate. And I think we would say in most circumstances, if people have concerns, it is probably better to speak to the manager or the owner or whoever is on site than to try and take matters into their own hands. But obviously, as I explained in the first thing, which is similar to what the Minister said, there are common sense situations where people will say, you're in the wrong room.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Christine and then Alex, you've got follow-up questions.
Thank you very much. We haven't actually met before, so thank you very much for coming along. Just the questions that we've just heard and the answers seem to me to point up the whole basis of the issue that people have perhaps expressed concern over, this common sense approach. And, someone, how do you know if, on what grounds does someone look like a man or a woman, and when do you interject? Once you've done that, once you've said that my common sense tells me that this person is not a biological woman, how did they prove it? How did they then say, yes, I am a biological woman and I can use that facility if, as you say, there is no certificate, there is no paperwork that they can produce, when actually surely that was the whole point of the Gender Recognition Act and gender recognition certificates, so that we had a way of saying this person is entitled to use that facility.
Well,
how do we do it now?
I think. I mean, there's a few issues here. So first of all, I mean, one of the things that the Supreme Court pointed out was that making access to a service dependent on whether or not you had a certificate, which was confidential, was not a satisfactory way of resolving things. We do have an issue that we don't have any documentation that reliably proves sex. Nevertheless, we still manage to operate all sorts of single-sex services very effectively because the vast majority of people follow the rules. And we have single-sex toilets at the moment. We don't have to check the sex of people going into them. There are organisations that run single-sex violence against women services very effectively at the moment. I think that there is an issue that there is no legal documentation. I fully accept that, and that's recognised in the code. But that doesn't mean that these services aren't operable.
But my point was, to use the terminology of the Supreme Court and the guidance, a biological woman is challenged going into a single-sex space for perhaps good reason on the part that, their common sense tells them that this may not be a biological woman. How do we prove that we are?
Well, in most circumstances where people are challenged, as soon as they open their mouth, say something, it's normally, from my experience, somebody catches a glimpse out of the corner of their eye and isn't sure and checks, and somebody says, oh, I am in the right place, I'm a woman, and that is fine. That's how things operate all the time right now.
If someone says to you, oh no, I am a biological woman, how do you know that they're not?
Well, what we explain in the code is that the decision you make has to depend on, the service that you're providing, the seriousness of it remaining single sex, what the evidence is, if there has been complaints, all of those sorts of things. But we have operated for decades with legislation that has allowed for single sex services, and we have managed to deliver those very effectively. From before the Gender Recognition Act, there's provision in the original Sex Discrimination Act allowing for single-sex services. We have been able to operate those effectively. And by and large, it's dependent on people following the rules. And then if they're not followed, on people taking kind of proportionate and sensible action and sensitive action, because we do talk in the code about how you ask and in ensuring sensitivity, for example.
Thank you very much.
Can I just come back to a point that you made earlier, Mary-Ann, saying it may be proportionate to exclude a trans man from an activity based on his appearance, for example, his facial hair. So you're saying that it can be proportionate to exclude people based on their appearance. So would that equally apply to a woman who didn't conform to gender stereotypes?
No, I don't think it would. Here again, we are referring to the Supreme Court judgment, and it came up in the situation of sport, for example, where they said that if you had a trans man who was taking testosterone, it might very well be proportionate to exclude them from female sporting activity because of the unfair advantage that being on testosterone would give them over and above other women.
Apologies, I didn't make it clear that I wasn't referring to sporting activities
right, okay.
in that question.
So the Supreme Court also talked about situations where it might be proportionate to exclude trans men from female-only services where the process of gender transition they had undergone had changed their experience, their appearance. And you see this. I mean, this. I'm sure those of us who are on social media will see it a lot, where people will post pictures of trans men who appear to be male and say you're going to basically saying these trans men should be in a women-only refuge or women-only situation. And the Supreme Court decided that the purpose of the exemption for or the exception for discrimination on the basis of gender reassignment was precisely in order to deal with that, those relatively small number of cases. And we are very clear in the code that would have to be on a case-by-case basis. This is not about how well somebody performs femininity. There is a very big difference between somebody who has short hair and wears trousers to somebody who has been on testosterone for a large number of years. And so that is what the code, I mean, these are quite complicated and difficult issues, but that is what the code is trying to reflect, which is exactly what came up in the Supreme Court judgment. I mean, it's there because it was in the Supreme Court judgment.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Alex quickly because it's a follow-up to this question, and then to Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. You've said these things are very different, and you've said that this isn't about performing masculinity or femininity, and I agree with you that we have to take the heat out of this discussion, because I want to protect women's spaces and women's safety, and I want to protect trans safety as well. And so the practical, I don't mean to be crass, the practical implications of this are significant for groups. I am a woman with a gender neutral name, short grey hair. I have had people accidentally saying to me, "Oh, so are your grandchildren here?" I've had people accidentally saying to me, "Excuse me, sir," because they're behind me. They're mortified, I hope, in both situations when they realise that's not the case. But it is easy to misidentify people. At what point should we be asking? At what point should somebody be saying to me, "Excuse me, Alex, are you actually a man? Excuse me, Alex, are you actually," at what point are organisations going to be litigated against for not asking those questions?
So I think it would depend. I mean, part of the litigation that we've seen so far against organisations has been for them saying this is our policy, that we are that spaces that women might expect to be single sex will admit trans women, and that's why there's been cases brought against them. I think that one of the things we try to make clear in the code is that this sort of enforcement has to be proportionate. And it depends on the circumstances and the service that you are operating. So, as I've said, we don't, we specifically say we're not expecting service providers to police the use of toilets. We don't do that at the moment. There are circumstances, for example, if you're running a women's refuge or running a rape crisis centre that maybe has a female-only space or female-only rape crisis centre, where you may have to ask on occasion, and that should be done sensitively and discreetly. I think it is highly unlikely that women working in the violence against women and girls sector are going to be mistaking women with short hair or names that could be male or female as men. I do think, knowing the sector,
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly pick up on that point. You said, well, you're not expecting organisations or businesses or workplaces to police the toilets correctly. What is the sanction then, and the enforcement for somebody not using the toilets correctly, is that on the individual or is that on the organisation or the building?
So the code covers what's required of organisations. What we're saying is where you've got toilets that are incidental to the main service, you're running a shopping centre or a train station, nobody's expecting you. Obviously, if there are regular complaints, if there is a sustained and ongoing problem, you might need to improve signage, you might need to improve policies, you might... is there any sanction or punishment for not complying, or for them not doing it? Because at the moment it seems like the onus is all very much on the individual, and I wonder where they stand legally on that.
The law bears on the service provider, which is the
but
service
you've just
provider.
said that it's not their responsibility to police it.
So it's not proportionate. I mean, it wouldn't generally be proportionate. There may be occasions when, you know, for example, a gym changing room where there might be complaints and a service provider might need to take action or might need to speak to somebody. If you know, the sort of cases that might be brought, the sorts of cases we have seen so far. Around, for example, changing rooms and toilets have been largely kind of workplace based, which the code doesn't cover. What neither the Equality Act nor our code covers is the behaviour of individuals. Obviously, service providers can set, you know, if they set a rule, then they can set a rule that says if you don't follow this rule, we are going to ask you to leave. And that would be what they did. But there isn't, you know, there is no, for example, criminal offence of using the wrong space unless...
If a service provider either doesn't have a policy or has a policy but it is widely flouted in a way that creates a situation that is unsafe or discriminatory against women, then they are very vulnerable to a case being brought against them.
I would argue that
that's the way it plays out.
Women walk around very fairly unsafely pretty much in every public space, unfortunately.